As we begin, I'd like to open up our Bibles to Revelation chapter 17. The book of Revelation chapter 17. And we read in verse 1 and on, it says, "There came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore, that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." Now, in order for us to understand who this great whore is that the kings of the earth are committing fornication with, and this great whore that's making all the earth drunk with her fornication, we need to look at a few symbols in order to identify who this whore woman is of Revelation chapter 17. If you go back in your Bibles to Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 6 through 8, we read these words, and these words will help us unlock this symbol of a whore woman. Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 6 through 8. It said, "The Lord said also unto me in the days of Josiah the king, Hast thou seen that which backsliding Israel hath done? She is gone up upon every high mountain and under every green tree, and there hath played the harlot." Now right here in verse 6 of Jeremiah chapter 3, it's saying that God's people who had great light, great truth, and great privileges went into apostasy, and because of her apostasy, God's people were known as a harlot. Now verse 8 of Jeremiah chapter 3 says, "And I saw when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away, and given her a bill of divorce, yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also." So God's people, once again, who had great light and great privileges, they turned away from those, and because of that were called a harlot or a whore woman. Now we find that same symbol in Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 21. Isaiah 1 verse 21 says, "How is the faithful city become an harlot? It was full of judgment, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers." So God's people were called a harlot. Now we find that symbol repeatedly in the Old Testament. I will not look at all of them here today, but I will refer to them just briefly. In Ezekiel chapter 16, you find God's people over and over again referred to as a harlot. You also find it throughout the book of Hosea, that the ancient prophet was told to go and marry a woman of whoredoms that would be representative of God's people who had gone into spiritual apostasy. So throughout the Word of God, a whore represents an apostate church that once had great light, but refused it and went into gross apostasy. So over in Revelation chapter 17 then, we are dealing with an apostate religious power, an apostate church. Now verse 2 gives us another key symbol that will help us unlock who this whore really is. Revelation 17 verse 2, it says, "With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication." Now fornication, of course, in a physical sense, involves two people joining together that have no right to be together. That is in a physical sense. In a spiritual sense, fornication is the mixture of the church with the state. It is also the mixture of truth with error. So right here in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 2, we have this great whore, this great apostate church, joining up with the kings or nations of this world, joining up with the United Nations on this earth. and sharing with these political powers her teachings and her goals. So this religious power is involved with the governments of this world. It also says that this apostate church has made the earth drunk with the wine of her fornication. Now we know in Scripture, in the book of Matthew chapter 9, Jesus talked about wine. Let's take a look at that in Matthew chapter 9. Matthew 9, starting with verse 14. It says, "Then came to him the disciples of John, saying, Why do we and the Pharisees fast off, but thy disciples fast not? Jesus said unto them, Can the children of the bride chamber mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken from them, and then shall they fast." Now what was Jesus talking about here? Jesus, of course, was the bridegroom. And he was saying, why should my disciples fast while I am here? He said, one day, though, soon, when I am taken away, then will my disciples fast. Going on, verses 16 and 17, Jesus said, "No man puts a piece of new cloth into an old garment, for that which is put in to fill it up taketh from the garment, and the rent is made worse. Neither do men put new wine into old bottles. Else the bottles break, and the wine runneth out, and the bottles perish. But they put new wine into new bottles, and both are preserved." Now what was Jesus talking about, this new wine? They don't put it into old bottles, but they put it into new bottles. Very simply, that new wine represented the doctrines of Christ that brought out the beauties of the Old Testament Scriptures. And Jesus said, we're not going to mix the doctrines of Scripture and the teachings of Christ with the traditions and the doctrines of the Pharisees. So the wine here in Matthew chapter 9, the new wine represented the beautiful, pure doctrine of Scripture, whereas the old wine, the old bottles, represented the doctrines of the Pharisees. And Jesus made very, very clear that he was not going to mix his teachings and the teachings of the Old Testament with the traditions and customs of the religious people of his day. So the wine then represents doctrine. Wine represents doctrine. Isaiah chapter 28, which we don't have time today to look at, also brings out that ancient Israel was made drunk by the traditions and the apostasy and falsehood of their religious teachers in the days of Isaiah the prophet. So in Revelation chapter 17, then, these three symbols that we have now unlocked, we have an apostate religious church that unites with the governments of the world, that teaches false doctrines, the traditions of men, instead of the commandments of God. I believe, Keith, it's very, very clear at this point who this whore woman of Revelation chapter 17 is. Verse 6 brings out another characteristic. It says that the woman was drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So this apostate church not only unites with the governments of the world, not only promotes her false teachings, her traditions above the Ten Commandments of God, but also is a persecutor of God's true and faithful people. Revelation 17, this whore, mother harlot, can only be one power, and that would be the Roman Catholic Church. Now I want us to look at verse 3 for another symbol and characteristic. It says, "He carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness." And it was in the wilderness where John saw this whore woman. Now, for those of us who have analyzed a little bit of history, I think we could all summarize and come to the conclusion that during the Dark Ages of 1260 years of papal supremacy that went from 538 to 1798, the papacy was by no means in the wilderness. The papacy was alive and well, telling the governments of the world exactly what to do and demanding obedience of people throughout the then known world. But in 1798, the papacy, according to Revelation 13 and verse 3, received their deadly wound. They lost their power over the governments of Europe. And in 1798, the papacy went behind the scenes. And the word there in Revelation 17, verse 3 for wilderness, the Greek word there means into a solitary or into a lonesome, desolate place. And only after 1798 could we take the position that the Roman papacy went into a lonesome, solitary, desolate place, because prior to that time she certainly did not. Now we also know in Revelation chapter 12, verses 6 and 14, that God's people, in verse 6 and in verse 14, had to flee into hiding or into a desolate place during the dark ages of 1260 years of papal supremacy. Revelation 12 and verse 6 says, "The woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days." And verse 14 says, "And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time, and times and half a time, from the face of the serpent." Well, we know in Revelation chapter 12 that this is a pure woman, and since an apostate church was identified as a whore woman in Revelation 17, in Revelation 12 we have a pure woman, which represents God's true church. And during this 1260-day or 1260-year period, during which the Roman Catholic Church ruled during the Dark Ages from 538 to 1798, God's true people truly went into the wilderness. They went into a lonesome, desolate place, into hiding. At this point, Keith and I are going to begin to look at different things that have taken place since 1798, in which the papacy indeed went into a lonesome, desolate place. They went behind the scenes, but the papacy has not changed. This concept, Keith, that we've been looking at concerning the papacy going into the wilderness, as we analyze here, Keith, a few statements that we have here in front of us, we will realize that the Vatican has one entity within itself, that its whole purpose of existence and its whole method of existence is secrecy, deception, working behind the scenes to control governments and take over churches. And the group that is within the Vatican itself, Keith, that I'm talking about, is the Jesuit order. I want to read a statement to you, Keith. This is from The History of Protestantism by J.A. Wiley, page 412. It says, "There was no disguise they could not assume. Therefore there was no place into which they could not penetrate. They could enter unheard the closet of the monarch or the cabinet of the statesman. They could sit unseen in convocation or general assembly and mingle unsuspected in the deliberations and debates. There was no tongue they could not speak, and no creed they could not profess, and thus there was no people among whom they might not sojourn, and no church whose membership they might not enter, and whose functions they might not discharge. They could execrate the Pope with the Lutheran and swear the solemn league with the Covenanter." Now I want us to take careful note. It says they could enter unheard the closet of the monarch or the cabinet of the statesman. So they would work behind the scenes to take over governments. It also said there was no church whose membership they might not enter, and whose functions they might not discharge. So you wonder today why you hear people saying, well, it's okay to have Catholics have week of prayer at our college. Well, who's behind that, Keith? Is that a solid, biblical Seventh-day Adventist? God help us.
No.
It obviously is because of the infiltration and the maneuverings behind the scenes of the Jesuit order. The dismantling of doctrines that we have held dear as Seventh-day Adventists over the last 50 years have been picked apart, dissected, and just thrown down the river. And we say, well, you know, it's because they're outdated. Well, no, they're not. It's because of the infiltration and the carrying out of functions of the Jesuit order. That's what's going on. Keith, I believe you've got there a document that states about how John Adams understood the infiltration of the Jesuits into governments and their desire to overthrow them. And I believe it's something that he wrote to a friend of his that we also are well aware of, Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, he did. And Bill, that was written on May 15th, 1816. My history of the Jesuits is not eloquently written, but it is supported by unquestionable authorities. It is very particular and very horrible. Their restoration is indeed a step towards darkness, cruelty, perfidy, despotism, and death. I do not like the appearance of the Jesuits. If ever there were a body of men who merited damnation on earth and in hell, it is this Society of Loyalists.
Keith, I believe as we continue to analyze the events that have transpired since John Adams, we're going to realize the truthfulness of what he said and the danger that exists for any church or any country to allow the Jesuits access to their land. Another statement, Keith, that we have here is something from Great Controversy, where Ellen White also was very, very clear and was shown how the Jesuits are a body that we are to have nothing to do with, that their only attempt is to destroy and annihilate governments and churches. In Great Controversy, page 234, we read this. It says, Protestantism was menaced by formidable foes. The first triumphs of the Reformation past, Rome summoned new forces, hoping to accomplish its destruction. At this time, the order of the Jesuits was created, the most cruel, unscrupulous, and powerful of all the champions of popery, cut off from earthly ties and human interests, dead to the claims of natural affection, reason, and conscience wholly silenced. They knew no rule, no tie but that of their order, and no duty but to extend its power. The gospel of Christ had enabled its adherents to meet danger and endure suffering, undismayed by cold, hunger, toil, and poverty, to uphold the banner of truth in face of the rack, the dungeon, and the stake. To combat these forces, Jesuitism inspired its followers with a fanaticism that enabled them to endure like dangers and to oppose to the power of truth all the weapons of deception. There was no crime too great for them to commit, no deception too base for them to practice, no disguise too difficult for them to assume. Vowed to perpetual poverty and humility, it was their studied aim to secure wealth and power, to be devoted to the overthrow of Protestantism and the reestablishment of the papal supremacy. That's very interesting, Keith, in light of Ellen White's statement here, that the triumphs of the Reformation were going forward with lightning speed throughout Europe. And then we find in the 1540s, 1550s, 1560s, we find the Council of Trent and the setting up of the Jesuit order. And Keith, we know that through the Protestant Reformation, the great doctrines that Martin Luther established, one, of course, was sola scriptura, or the Bible only. Another was sola fide, or by faith alone. And those two doctrines, Keith, attacked the ideas of the papacy, where they wanted to exalt their traditions instead of the Word of God and His holy law of 10 Commandments. Also, Luther said, you cannot save yourselves by your works. And that was the heart of Roman Catholicism. And so Luther came along and said, no, we look away from ourselves, we look to Jesus. Amen. For forgiveness and for power to obey. And then, Keith, not only were those two doctrines well founded in Protestantism, but we also realized that Protestantism, Keith, identified beyond a shadow of a doubt who the little horn of Daniel 7 is, who the great whore of Revelation 17 is, and they exalted before the world a true interpretation of Bible prophecy. Well, Keith, as we analyze the introduction and the building up of the Jesuit order, we find them attacking those very items. We find them saying, no, look away from Scripture. You can't understand it. Look to doctors. Look to theologians. They'll tell you. We find them attacking the doctrine of sola fide, where they're saying, now, today, instead of saying it's, just works, we find the Jesuits of today saying, well, everything was done at the cross. It's just everything was done back there. Jesus doesn't have to do anything in our lives today. You see? That's what the Jesuits are saying today, Keith. And then you have the Jesuit order of the Reformation. They're saying we've got to attack Protestant interpretation of the prophecies. And so as Luther pointed, and all the reformers pointed to the papacy as the little horn and the whore of Revelation, the Jesuits came along and said, we've got to get everybody's eyes off the correct interpretation of Daniel and Revelation. We've got to either put everything in the past or everything in the future. And thus, Keith, is created these ideas that put time prophecy in the past, literal days, or we find reinterpretation of prophecy and saying, no, it's all in the future. And we have this reinterpretation of the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation. And so, Keith, we find an attack in the Reformation over the Bible, the message of righteousness by faith, and the prophecies. And Keith, that is exactly what we see happening throughout Christendom today. In the nominal churches, in the professed churches of God today, we find it everywhere. So we find the inroads of the Society of Jesus throughout our world today. Now, Keith, before we go on, I just want to make one comment concerning a book that I'm going to be quoting from a great deal today. It's a book called Is Alberto for Real? And it looks at statements about Alberto Rivera, a man who has claimed that he was once a Roman Catholic priest, who saw many of the inside workings of the Roman papacy, who escaped from it, and who now firmly believes that the papacy is the red whore of Revelation 17. But Keith, the purpose for me quoting extensively from this book today is not because I want to prove or disprove whether or not Alberto is for real, but because of the fact, Keith, that this book, Is Alberto for Real?, has so much good documentation as to what the Vatican has done in the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and also as it relates to communist Russia. So this book, Is Alberto for Real?, has such good documentation, and it is for that purpose that we will be quoting from it largely today. Keith, what I want us to look at right now, we've already analyzed that the papacy has worked behind the scenes. And I think the greatest way that we can look at that is in light of what happened in the United States from around 1830 right on up through the 1860s. And of course, I think we all know what I'm talking about, and that is the Civil War. Prior to that, Keith, of course, there were other events, more personal events in the life of Abraham Lincoln that were transpiring. In 1856, Abraham Lincoln was defending a Roman Catholic priest who had been falsely accused of rape. His name was Charles Chiniquy. And the trial of Charles Chiniquy gives us a real good backdrop as we lead into the Civil War, who caused the Civil War, and then who caused the death of Abraham Lincoln. It was in 1856 that Charles Chiniquy, a Roman Catholic priest, was tried in Urbana, Illinois, falsely accused of rape. Charles Chiniquy, through the intervention of Abraham Lincoln and a woman who overheard the plot to destroy Chiniquy, he was set free. But in that courtroom that day in Urbana, Illinois, were at least 10 Jesuits. And Charles Chiniquy, as he and Abraham Lincoln left the courtroom, Charles Chiniquy stated, "Mr. Lincoln, I'm filled with joy that I'm off, but I'm filled with sorrow because in the eyes of the Jesuits in this courtroom today, I read your sentence of death in their eyes." And as we begin to unravel now the Civil War and who brought it about, and then the death of Abraham Lincoln, it's going to become very clear that that trial in Urbana happened just not as a coincidence, but in essence directly related to the death of Abraham Lincoln. I'd like to read a statement from Charles Chiniquy's book called 50 Years in the Church of Rome. This is page 280. And I quote, he said, "There were in the court not less than 10 or 12 Jesuits from Chicago and St. Louis who came to hear my sentence of condemnation to the penitentiary, but it was on their heads that you have brought the thunders of heaven and earth. Nothing can be compared to the expression of their rage against you, when you not only wrenched me from their cruel hands, but you were making the walls of the courthouse tremble under the awful and superhumanly eloquent denunciation of their infamy, diabolical malice, and total want of Christian and human principle in the plot they had formed for my destruction. What troubles my soul just now and draws my tears is that it seems to me that I have read your sentence of death in their fiendish eyes. How many other noble victims have already fallen at their feet?" And then it says, he tried to divert my mind at first with a joke. "Sign this," said he, "it will be my warrant of death." But after I had signed, he became more serious and said, "I know that Jesuits never forget nor forsake, but man must not care how and where he dies, provided he dies at the post of honor and duty." So right there in the court trial of Abraham Lincoln, where Abraham Lincoln defended Charles Chiniquy, it becomes very clear that the Jesuits wanted Abraham Lincoln dead, and they were going to do everything to see that carried out. Now, in regard to the Civil War and who brought it out, I'd like to read from a book called 50 Years in the Church of Rome by Charles Chiniquy once more. And this is quoting Abraham Lincoln. "This war, the American Civil War, would never have been possible without the sinister influence of the Jesuits. We owe it to popery that we now see our land reddened with the blood of her noblest sons. Though there were great differences of opinion between the South and the North on the question of slavery, neither Jeff Davis," of course he was the president of the Confederacy, "neither Jeff Davis nor any one of the leading men of the Confederacy would have dared to attack the North had they not relied on the promises of the Jesuits that under the mask of democracy, the money and the arms of the Roman Catholics, even the arms of France, were at their disposal if they would attack us. That is taken from page 296 in Charles Chiniquy's book, 50 Years in the Church of Rome. So, Keith, I'm hearing from Abraham Lincoln that behind the scenes, behind Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and all the other Confederate soldiers and generals was none other than the Jesuits of Rome. That's what Chiniquy was saying. That's what Abraham Lincoln was saying. I want to read another statement to us now. This is also on page 281 in Chiniquy's book, 50 Years in the Church of Rome. It reads this way, and this is quoting, Chiniquy here in this page is quoting a high-ranking priest in the Roman Catholic Church. It says, "We are determined to take possession of the United States, but we must proceed with the utmost secrecy and wisdom." What does a skillful general do when he wants to conquer a country? Does he scatter his soldiers over the farmlands and spend their energy in plowing the fields? No, he keeps them close to his flanks and marching toward the strongholds, the rich and powerful cities. Going on down a few sentences, it says, "Silently and patiently, we must mass our Roman Catholics in the great cities of the United States, remembering that the vote of a poor journeyman, though he be covered with rags, has as much weight in the scale of power as the millionaire Astor, and that if we have 2 votes against his one, he will become as powerless as an oyster." And then going over, it says, "Then we will rule the United States and lay them at the feet of the Vicar of Jesus Christ, that he may put an end to their godless system of education and impious laws of liberty of conscience, which are an insult to God and to man." Now, Keith, right here, I believe that this Roman Catholic priest has hit it right on the head. This is the sole purpose of the Roman Catholic Church, is to destroy in the United States the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and those rights that guarantee liberty of conscience. You see, the Roman Catholic Church, down through time, has always stated that anybody who believed in liberty of conscience was to them anathema. They were cursed. In fact, we read in Great Controversy, page 564, this is a quote from Pope Pius IX of 1854, where he states this: "The Constitution of the United States guarantees liberty of conscience. Nothing is dearer or more fundamental." Now, Pope Pius IX states this: "The absurd and erroneous doctrines or ravings in defense of liberty of conscience are a most pestilential error, a pest of all others most to be dreaded in a state." Now, this same Pope, Pope Pius IX, he was the only leader in the world during the Civil War that held out his hand of support to Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy. In 1864, Pope Pius IX anathematized those who assert the liberty of conscience and of religious worship, also all such as maintain that the Church may not employ force. So we ask ourselves for just a moment here, the Civil War was brought on to destroy the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that guaranteed freedom to all Americans. And who is it that is attacking the liberties and the Bill of Rights in the United States today? Who is it that's behind the attempts to destroy the Second Amendment, which guarantees the right of all Americans to bear arms? Who is it that's behind the destruction of the freedom of speech here in our land today, and of religious freedom as well? It's none other than the same power that was behind the destruction of the United States during the Civil War, the Roman Catholic Church. Charles Chiniquy goes on, page 283. Long before I was ordained a priest, I knew that my church was the most implacable enemy of this republic. My professors of philosophy, history, and theology had been unanimous in telling me that the principles and laws of the Church of Rome were absolutely antagonistic to the laws and principles which are the foundation stones of the Constitution of the United States. Now that makes my blood curdle, Keith, when I think about the fact that the current administration in power in the United States, that the leader of this administration was trained at a Jesuit institution by a man named Carroll Quigley, who believed in a new world order and the breaking down and destruction of the fabric of the United States of America. And that is exactly what we are seeing today.
That kind of shows us, doesn't it, Bill, that nothing has changed?
Nothing, absolutely nothing has changed, Keith. And all we can see, Keith, as we saw in Revelation 17, through the Dark Ages, the papacy did everything out in the open. But today, she uses all of her arms, and she works behind the scenes, pulling the strings.
That's even more dangerous when you can't see it.
That's exactly right, Keith. Exactly. Going on over Charles Chiniquy on page 290. It states this: it's under those bloody banners that 6,000 Roman Catholic priests, Jesuits, and bishops in the United States are marching to the conquest of this republic. Without Romanism, the last awful civil war would have been impossible. The diabolical and anti-social laws of Rome caused a Roman Catholic, Beauregard, to be the man chosen to fire the first gun at Fort Sumter. Now, how many of you have ever read in your 5th grade history books about the firing of that first gun at Fort Sumter? It was fired by a Roman Catholic. Chiniquy goes on, he says, those anti-Christian and anti-social laws caused the Pope of Rome to be the only crowned prince in the whole world so depraved as to publicly shake hands with Jeff Davis and proclaim him president of a legitimate government. Now going on down here, he also, Chiniquy ties in not just Rome's involvement with the Civil War, but also Rome's involvement with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. These are the laws which led the assassins of Abraham Lincoln to the house of a rabid Roman Catholic woman, Mary Surratt, which was not only the rendezvous of the priests of Washington, but the very dwelling house of some of them. Those bloody and infernal laws of Rome nerved the arm of the Roman Catholic Booth when he slaughtered one of the noblest men God has ever given to the world. Now right there, Charles Chiniquy confirms that it was the Roman Catholics, the Jesuits, who 9 years after Urbana, when Chiniquy was let off and set free, Abraham Lincoln was killed by a Roman Catholic. Now, Keith, I believe that you've got some documentation there from Major Thomas Harris in a document that he wrote in which he was exposing the dangers that the United States should feel towards the Roman papacy. And he also talks about the Roman papacy's involvement in protecting the murderers and the conspirators of Abraham Lincoln. What do you have, Keith?
Well, Bill, Well, just let me quote it. I think that's probably the best way.
Okay.
In the early part of September 1865, these unholy fathers thought it safe to unload their charge onto the brethren in England, and so made arrangements for sending Surratt across the Atlantic under assumed name and in disguise. For this purpose, they arranged for his passage on a British steamer, the Peruvian, which was to sail from Quebec on 16th of September 1865.
Keith, I want to, now this Surratt right here, Mary Surratt, of course, for her involvement, she was killed.
She was hung.
Hung.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this was her brother.
This was John Surratt.
John Surratt, her
Okay.
brother.
Okay, and this is on page 32 of this document, Rome's Responsibility for the Assassination of Lincoln.
That's right. By Harris, written in 1867, I believe it was.
Okay, go ahead, Keith.
A physician with whom Bocher was well acquainted by the name of Macmillan had just gotten the position of surgeon on this vessel, and they arranged with him to take under his especial charge a man by the name of McCarthy, who for certain reasons wished to cross the Atlantic under an assumed name and in the most secret manner. The day before the Peruvian was to set sail from Quebec, these two unholy fathers conveyed Surratt in a covered carriage to
Now, who conveyed him?
the two unholy fathers,
Two Roman Catholic.
two Roman Catholic fathers whose names we'll see shortly.
Okay.
In a covered carriage to the steamer that was to carry passengers for the Peruvian from Montreal to Quebec. They had disguised Surratt by coloring his hair, painting his face, and putting spectacles over his eyes. Father LePerry went also in disguise of a citizen's dress, arriving on board the steamer. Surratt was immediately stored away in a stateroom, from which he did not emerge during the voyage. LePerry remained in his room with him. Reaching Quebec, these two unholy fathers placed their charge in the care of Dr. Macmillan. They then took their final leave of him. Rather than go ahead and quote the rest of it, let's just say that they made their trip, and Surratt needed some money. So he wired his friends in the States who had promised him all this help, and they just wired him back and said, "So sorry, no money."
Okay. Okay.
So he was put in a pretty bad spot. So with the help of his Catholic friends and the fathers, Catholic fathers in England, he went to Rome and joined the papal bodyguard, the personal army of the Pope.
Now, is that in this document, Keith?
That's in this document. That's on page 33. And I'll go ahead and read from here on. I mean, I was just bringing it up in a nutshell.
Okay.
Here he remained safely hidden away for a year or more, but was finally discovered by a government detective who had been sent in search of him, and who went voluntarily, hoping to get the offered reward, and who enlisted in the same company to which Surratt belonged. This detective informed our government of his discovery, and through the agents of our government, the Pope was informed that this soldier, who had enlisted under the name of Watson, was none other than the notorious John H. Surratt, who was a member of the conspiracy that accomplished the assassination of President Lincoln.
Okay, so what you have read, Keith, then, is that John Surratt was taken secretly up to Montreal and Quebec.
Right.
He was then put onto a ship under the control and under the guidance of a Dr. Macmillan, who was a
Correct.
Roman Catholic. He was then taken in a ship over to England, then brought down to Rome, and John Surratt was found in the papal army in Rome.
That's correct. That's correct.
And then the Pope was informed that this man in his army was none other than one of the conspirators to assassinate President Lincoln.
And he knew, of course, that there was a warrant for his arrest under the name Surratt, and he had enlisted under the name McCarthy.
As if Pope Pius IX, who hated the United States and liberty of conscience, as we've already read in his two encyclicals, did not know
Yes.
that John Surratt was indeed one of them.
Well,
Okay.
with a shrewd show of virtuous innocence, the Pope hastened to clear his skirts, and those of his underlings by ordering his arrest and rendition to our government without waiting for its requisition. He was arrested by the Pope's authority, but was allowed to escape by his guards, and thus given another chance for life and liberty. The story was that he made his escape by a bold leap over a precipice at the risk of his life.
Sure.
Quoted here, "Tell this to the Marines, the old sailors will not believe it." He was finally captured in Alexandria, Egypt, and was brought home in chains, where he was held to answer for his crime. So it really shows that the papacy, the papal church, the hierarchy of it, knew all the time, knew all along from day one, who they made the arrangements. They made the arrangements.
We're going to find, Keith, that this was not the last time that the papacy took men who were responsible for horrible crimes and secretly pushed them out of the country where they had perpetrated their activities and put them into other countries.
That's right.
And have protected them for many, many years. So far, of course, then, Keith, we have seen that the papacy after 1798 went behind the scenes. And then, of course, we were just noticing that the papacy was involved with the Civil War, seeking to split America, divide it in two, so that then they could take over this whole Western Hemisphere. They already had South America, they already had Mexico, and they wanted to use slavery as the key that would trigger them splitting America in two and then sitting on top of the rubble once it was all over. And I think, Keith, we can see a similar situation taking place in America today. If you, of course, remember, and we'll just touch on this now, but in the last 6 months, we've had some very, very challenging things take place here in the United States along racial lines. I don't think anybody in America does not know and is not aware of the O.J. Simpson trial.
That's right.
And how, as the O.J. Simpson trial proceeded, it became a trial over race, as they had the testimony of that policeman who obviously was extremely prejudiced. The trial turned to being one that was over a race issue. And Keith, I personally believe, as I have read in various accounts, and many others see it too, that this was a planned attempt by the Jesuits to split America again along racial lines.
We have the Million Man March too. That was basically it was definitely racial, and they intend to use that to split Americans as well, Bill.
Absolutely. The one that was spearheaded by Louis Farrakhan on Washington, D.C. in mid-October. I believe, Keith, that what has gone on in history has been repeated again and again and again, and we're going to continue to see this throughout our two tapes here. And once again, Keith, the point that we've been hitting continually here is that the papacy has not changed.
Amen.
What they were back in the Dark Ages, they are still today. They're just biding their time till they can strike with great terror and great force upon Americans and all those throughout the world that love liberty. We're going to go on now up into the 20th century, and we're going to take a look now at World War I. First off, I would like to read from a book called Peter's Tomb, Recently Discovered. On page 63, Peter's Tomb, Recently Discovered, written by Paul Peterson. Page 63, we read this statement. It says, "The popes have been in or instigated most, if not all, of the European wars down through the centuries." In a book by Edmund Paris, this is on page 47 of his book called The Vatican Against Europe. we read this: Pope Pius X, in his hatred against Orthodox Christians, was continually inciting Emperor Francis Joseph of Austria-Hungary to chastise the Serbians. After Sarajevo, on July 26, 1914, Baron Ritter, the Bavarian representative of the Holy See, wrote to the Austrian government, and he said this: "The Pope approves of Austria's harsh treatment of Serbia. He has no great opinion of the armies of Russia and France in the event of a war against Germany. The Cardinal Secretary of State does not see when Austria could make war if she does not decide to do so now. There in the true colors is the Vicar of Christ, the Holy Pontiff, whom pious authors represent as having died of sorrow at seeing the outbreak of war." Now let's go back and just take a look at what Edmund Paris is saying in these few statements, Keith. Number one, Francis Joseph of Austria. Austria was Roman Catholic. The Serbians, and back in 1914, they had their own independent state at that time. The Serbians were independent, and they were Greek Orthodox. Now, since the 10th, 11th century, when the Orthodox Church of the East split from the papacy in the West, the papacy has wanted to take it over once again. Well, in 1914, when the man who was going to take over and become king of Austria, Archduke Ferdinand, when he and his wife were killed in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist, the Pope of Rome told Francis Joseph of Austria, "If you don't invade Serbia now, I can't think of a better time when you could." So the Pope of Rome encouraged and supported Francis Joseph invading Serbia in 1914. And it was that invasion that brought about the First World War. Because instantly, with the invasion of Serbia by Austria, Russia, France, Italy, Germany, and then England all entered World War I. And it was the Pope that encouraged World War I to begin. Edmund Paris picks it up again, talking about World War I. It says, "Thus it is proved that Pius X and his Secretary of State, when they encouraged the most Catholic emperor, Francis Joseph, to make war, they were coldly contemplating the consequences of their act, a conflict which would set the Central European empires against France and Russia." Now, Keith, this is a very important thing that we need to realize right here. For 10 centuries, the Catholic Church was seeking to overwhelm the Orthodox Church in Russia and in Serbia. And in World War I, the papacy saw a prime opportunity to reestablish themselves in Russia. Now that fact has paved the way throughout the 20th century. The history of the 20th century has been written based on that goal of the Roman Catholic Church. Going on, Edmund Paris says, "They believed they had accurately estimated the strength of the different forces involved. But what the Pope and his accomplice had not foreseen was the participation in the war of England and finally of the entire Anglo-Saxon world, a participation which was to thwart their plans, tip the scales, and liberate the Orthodox populations from the Viennese yoke." Edmund Paris says, "Hence the responsibility for the crime of World War I, which threw into the charnel house millions of Christian corpses, the flower of European youth." He says it can quite specifically be stated that the Roman Catholic Church in 1914 started this hellish series of wars. It was then that the tribute of blood, which she has always taken from the peoples, began to swell to a veritable torrent. So in World War I, the papacy started World War I, according to Edmund Paris and Paul Peterson, two historians. They wanted to annihilate the Orthodox Serbs of Serbia, and they also wanted to annihilate the Orthodox Church in Russia. But in World War I, Keith, they failed.
Yes.
Now, whenever the papacy fails, they try again, but they use a different method. Now, right towards the end of World War I, there was a Marxist in Europe named Vladimir Ulyanov. We don't know him by that name today. We know him as Nikolai Lenin. Nikolai Lenin wanted to take over Tsarist Russia. And the papacy hoped, Keith, that if Lenin took over Tsarist Russia, that then if the papacy worked with Lenin, they could then take over the Greek Orthodox Church. So Lenin and the Catholic Church teamed up together in an attempt to overwhelm Tsarist Russia and the Orthodox Church. I want to read that to you in a statement here by Avro Manhattan in the book called The Vatican Billions, on page 120 and 121. It reads this way: "The overthrow of the Tsarist system, therefore, brought with it the inevitable overthrow of the established Orthodox Church." And that's what the Catholic Church was gunning for. To the Vatican, which had waged war against the Orthodox Church since the 11th century, the downfall of her millennial rival was too good to be true. The evil of Bolshevism, which of course led into communism, which Lenin was behind, could in this manner be accepted in view of its having destroyed the Orthodox Church, with one proviso, however, that it should give the Catholic Church a free hand to finish the task of eliminating orthodoxy in Russia once and for all. The deal was accepted, and it came to pass that while the Vatican was fomenting against Bolshevism, the Bolsheviks in the Kremlin and the Vatican's diplomats in Rome began secret negotiations. Lenin agreed with the Pope. Machineries were set up, papal commissions, some headed by American prelates, were dispatched to Bolshevik Russia, disguised as famine relief missions, and the like. In Rome, Catholic priests were given accelerated instruction in Russian Orthodox theology and ritual. Grandiose schemes were blueprinted for taking over the Orthodox Church lock, stock, and barrel, including the claims for her former wealth and lands. These to be put forward at a later stage, once Catholicism had taken over. Now, it's very, very obvious, though, that Nikolai Lenin did not follow through with his agreement that he made with the Vatican. Because shortly after World War I was over, Lenin reneged on his agreement. And then, of course, began the time that would go all the way down to the late 1980s, in which communism would reign supreme in Russia and the Vatican would remain largely outside.
That's exactly why the Vatican has always hated communism so much. They've always said because it was a religious-less society, and that's not true. They hated communism because Lenin double-crossed them.
That's exactly right. Now, Keith, let me ask. We've analyzed World War I. The Vatican wanted to knock out the Serbs, the Orthodox Serbs, in what we know today as Yugoslavia or Bosnia. They failed.
Right.
They wanted to annihilate the Orthodox Church in Russia.
That's right.
They failed through World War I and their allies. Then they failed through Lenin.
Right.
Now, Keith, something else of a very, very important magnitude was taking place right towards the end of World War I. You remember what it was?
The League of Nations.
All right, the League of Nations, all right. And there was one other thing that I'd like to read about just briefly. We're going to look at this in greater detail, Keith, tomorrow. But it had to do with a vision that three young, illiterate young ladies had in a place called Fatima in Portugal. And I want to read just briefly. It happened in 1917, a year, Keith, before World War I came to a close. I want to read what these three young ladies were told by the Virgin Mary. Now, before we go any further, Keith, I think we need to make clear it was three demon spirits, spirits of devils, that were communicating in the guise of the Virgin Mary to these young illiterate girls in Fatima, Portugal. And I read this statement. This is from page 27 of the book called Vietnam, Why Did We Go? By Avro Manhattan. It reads this way, page 27. It says, the Catholic masses were told to believe that the sun, on the appearance of the Virgin Mary, had moved on a zigzag course, as proof of the authenticity of her presence and, of course, of her messages. The Virgin's messages had been to induce the Pope to bring about the consecration of the world to her Immaculate Heart, to be followed by the consecration of, guess what, big power? Russia. The consecration of Russia. Russia will be converted, the Virgin Mary told these young girls. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me. But, she warned, should this not be accomplished, Russia's errors will spread throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions. Different nations will be destroyed. But in the end, however, the Virgin promised by way of consolation that the Catholic Church would triumph, after which the Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me. Thereupon she, Russia, shall be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. Now, Keith, I have another startling statement here. Let me see if I can come across it real quickly. Yes, here it is. Keith, Pope John Paul II, in Time, December 30, 1991, page 64 and 65, states, John Paul is firmly convinced that Mary brought an end to communism throughout Europe. The Virgin predicted the rise of Soviet totalitarianism before it happened. In a subsequent vision, she directed the Pope and his bishops to consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart in order to bring communism to an end. Well, Keith, within the heart of the Vatican, they wanted to destroy communism. They wanted to destroy the Orthodox Church.
Right.
They failed once again through Lenin. They failed through their ally partners in World War I. And now they bring on the scene demon spirits working through an aberration of Mary to declare that Russia would one day be converted to the papacy once again. And so as the papacy has failed through World War I and through Lenin, they're about to try again.
It should be noted, Bill, that this Pope, this current Pope, Pope Paul II, John Paul II, has rededicated his office in the Catholic Church to the Virgin Mary.
Okay. We're going to be picking up, Keith, so much more
Yes.
as we look at events transpiring today at the Virgin Mary. But now what we want to do is turn our eyes, Keith, because roughly 20 years after the papacy failed in World War I, they began their machinery once again, and they were going to try to destroy Orthodox Christianity once more in something that we know as World War II. World War II, one that we, Keith, always have analyzed as the War of Adolf Hitler, the War of Benito Mussolini, the War of Francisco Franco and the atomic bomb. But Keith, let's go today behind the scenes. We've gone behind the scenes with the Civil War, and we've seen how the papacy was in the wilderness, behind the scenes, pulling the strings in the Confederacy. We saw how John Wilkes Booth was simply a puppet of Rome to bring about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And then, of course, we saw how the papacy sought to destroy Orthodox Christianity in World War I via her allied powers and then with Lenin. But she failed. And World War II was just one more attempt of the Vatican to bring down Orthodox Christianity in the world. Let's take a look at some statements here, Keith, this morning. This is taken from a book by Andrew Sinclair called The Great Silence Conspiracy on page 9. Just to give us a little idea as to the Catholics' involvement with Germany. It says, who wrote Mein Kampf? Now, Mein Kampf, of course, was the book that was attributed to Adolf Hitler. Mein Kampf meant my story. It says Mein Kampf was the Nazi Bible. Was supposed to have been written by Hitler, but Otto Strasser says in Hitler and I that Mein Kampf was written by a Roman Catholic priest. Father Bernhard Stempel, from notes supplied by Hitler. Otto Strasser, a Roman Catholic, was one of the founders of the Nazi Party. Stempel, a notorious anti-Semite, was a member of the Roman Catholic Order of St. Jerome. So the very book, My Story, was written by a Roman Catholic. Let's go on over to The Vatican Against Europe by Edmund Paris, page 15. Mr. Paris, on page 15 of that book called The Vatican Against Europe, says this: in 1922, Pope Pius XI donned the tiara. The papacy had lost the First War. It was about to prepare for the Second. What was happening in Europe between the two massacres? In Italy, secret negotiations took place between papal agents and Mussolini, the man of providence. The priest Don Sturgio, chief of the Catholic group, had full rights voted to the Duce on November 1922. Now that's exactly, Keith, what we read in Revelation 17, that the papacy would unite with the kings of the earth to carry out her plans and her purposes. And Don Sturgio, the chief of the Catholic group in Italy, wielded so much power that he could give full power to Mussolini in Italy. Now, is it any wonder that 7 years later, Benito Mussolini gave great amounts of land and money and power back into the control of the Vatican? It says, then came the Lateran Treaty to seal the union of fascism and the papacy, the conquest of Ethiopia blessed by the clergy, and on Good Friday 1939, the aggression against Albania. In Germany, the papal nuncio in Berlin, Monsignor Pacelli and Franz von Papen, privy chamberlain to the Pope, advocated a union with Rome and concentrated on the overthrow of the Weimar Republic. Two major Roman Catholic cardinals in Germany were seeking the overthrow of the Weimar Republic. Now the two, Keith, are very interesting here. Monsignor Pacelli was the man who became Pope Pius XII. He was the one who in 1939 began his reign as Pope and went on down to 1958. It was Monsignor Pacelli who not only brought about the overthrow of the Weimar Republic, which paved the way for Hitler, but it was also Pacelli that paved the way for the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was Monsignor Pacelli, as Pope Pius XII, who almost brought about World War III in the 1950s. Now, we'll be looking at that in the tape that we'll be doing after this one. So Monsignor Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, wielded great power in Germany. Franz von Papen was the papal representative in Germany at that time, and he worked very, very closely with Adolf Hitler. It says the German Catholics were hostile to Nazism, but they were informed by the Pope himself that he was favorably disposed towards Hitler. Consequently, the Catholic Zentrum voted full rights to Hitler on January 30, 1933. It was a Catholic majority that voted full rights to Mussolini. It was a Catholic majority that voted full rights to Hitler in Germany.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Keith. It says, in Spain, the Virgin appeared here and there, and effigies of Christ shed tears. On March 31st, 1934, the Pact of Rome was signed and pledged support of Mussolini and Hitler for the rebellion. The Holy War broke out. You see, we have this idea that the Crusades or the Holy Wars that the Vatican fought during the Dark Ages is a thing of the past. Oh, no, it is not.
Amen.
World War I was a holy war. World War II was a holy war fomented by the Vatican in order to destroy her religious and political opponents. That's what those two wars were. And Edmund Paris is indeed exactly correct. It says in 1937, in the midst of war, the Vatican gave de jure recognition to the government of Francisco Franco, the leader of Spain. Francisco Franco was its sword bearer, who was later to be decorated with the Supreme Order of Christ. Blessed be the guns if the gospel flowers in their wake. Soon the Catholic action was to spread its tyranny across the ruined country. So the three allied powers of the Vatican, Keith, Germany, Italy, and Spain, were all being pushed into the Second World War to destroy orthodoxy and communism, with the Vatican right behind them, pushing them, advising them, and leading them into the conflict. Now, I could go on and read so much more here, Keith. I'm just going to read another statement here leading up to World War II. This is called the Vatican-Moscow-Washington Alliance by Avro Manhattan. He says this, in 1929, the fascist government of Italy and the Vatican signed the Lateran Agreement, and Mussolini granted the Church the extraordinary privileges it had asked. The Church had turned its back on socialism, whether of a Marxist or of a Catholic kind, siding with anti-communist political forces of Europe. The most vigorous and powerful of these was Nazism. It goes on, it says how the Catholics gave Hitler full rights to form a legal government in 1933. It says this measure gave Hitler the dictatorial power he needed to destroy the German communists. After the law had been passed, the Vatican ordered the German Catholic Party to disband. In response to the Vatican directive, the German Catholic Party demobilized in the summer of 1933. Now, Keith, I wondered about that. I thought, why would the Vatican tell the Catholic Party in Germany to demobilize? And the thing that came to my mind, Keith, was this. Hitler is our man. We've got his strings. He's the one out in the forefront. You disband so that nobody will tie Germany and Rome together.
That's right.
Let's stay as far behind the scenes as we can, and let's keep our puppet ruler right out there in the front.
Yes.
Going on, it says the whole Vatican-Hitler bargain had been conducted in secret. In June of the same year, Hitler and the Vatican signed a concordat, under terms of which the Church swore allegiance to the Nazi regime. And going on down, it says Catholic Franz van Papen, the second in command to Hitler, stated this: the Third Reich is the first power which not only recognizes but puts into practice the high principles of the papacy.
Tells it right there, doesn't it?
There is no question. This is another statement from a book called The Hitler Phenomenon, written by Henry Picker. Page 8 of the book. He says, where was the Nazi Party founded? It was founded in Roman Catholic Bavaria. Its headquarters were in Munich, the Dublin of Germany. The Nazi regime was the brainchild of the Roman Catholic Church. Bottom line.
So now we see where the Catholic Church, as a church, was involved with the war between the states here in this country. They were involved with World War I. They were involved with World War II. Actually leaded out in causing these wars.
That's exactly right, Keith. That's exactly right. Now, Keith, something else. Let's analyze. We always hear about the concentration camps.
Yes.
Well, who set those up? Who was behind that, Keith? And who was put into those concentration camps? We all know, of course, it was the Jews. I want to read a statement, Keith, and then I want us to analyze a plan of operation of the Roman Catholic Church. Because we're going to see, Keith, that this plan of operation was started, it took place in Germany, it took place in Yugoslavia during World War II, and I believe it's happening in Yugoslavia, or what we know of Yugoslavia today in Bosnia. It happened in Vietnam, Keith, and it is happening right now in the United States of America. The papacy's plan of operation of destruction that they did in each of those four nations, Keith, it's identical.
Yes.
Let me read this statement about the concentration camps, and then I'll analyze that concept with you. This is taken from the book The Hitler Phenomenon, page 11. It says, Hitler himself often stated that his mentor in Judaism or Semitism was the Roman Catholic chief lay conductor of political Roman Catholicism in Austria, Dr. Karl Lueger, burgomaster of Vienna and leader of the Christian Social Party. Well, Keith, that's telling us right there. The man who was behind the operations and how to carry out things in Germany during the Second World War was a Roman Catholic. Now, Keith, let's analyze something here for just a moment. There was a political enemy that was set apart in Germany in the 1930s. You remember, of course, in 1933, just prior to Hitler being granted full rights as a leader, there was a fire at a chief government building over there called the Reichstag. And Keith, it's obvious that that fire was started by Hitler's people. There's documentation that would prove that the man who was held responsible for it could never have started a fire in that large of a building, and it could never have burned that much in that short amount of time unless it was pre-planned and a conspiracy was behind it all.
But a communist was convicted of it.
That's right. A communist was convicted of it, Keith. That's exactly right. So, Keith, Hitler isolated a political group and said, they're the problem. And, of course, he isolated the communists.
Right.
Now, Keith, who was the religious group that Hitler isolated and said, these people, this religious sect is causing all the trouble? What was the group called?
Jews.
The Jews. So he isolated a political power, he isolated a religious power, and then after that, Hitler began to take away all of the religious and social freedoms that the German people had. Now, after the freedoms were taken away, Hitler then brought about concentration camps and persecution of those who did not go along with his Catholic program. Now, I want you to remember those 4 points, because we're going to see those again and again and again throughout the course of these videotapes.
Now, even with the fire that Hitler had set, there was a communist involved.
Absolutely.
He actually did take part in it, but we know now that what he did himself could not have caused the destruction that was caused there. That Hitler and his own people had to have, because they're the only ones that had access, had to have knowingly set this communist up and set the fires themselves so that the total destruction would be there.
That's exactly right, Keith. Exactly. Keith, I want to tie together another point here. World War II, then, was caused because the Catholic Church wanted to destroy orthodoxy in Serbia and in Russia, and also, of course, destroy communism along with it. Let me read a statement to you that just very, very strong. The conversion of Russia, which Rome had hoped to achieve through the Bolshevik Revolution, was now attempted through the use of a foreign army. Now, this is taken, Keith, from the book called The Vatican Against Europe, written, I believe, by Edmund Paris. It's not mentioned here, but I believe he's the one that wrote the book. The Vatican Against Europe. And this is on pages 238 and 239. It says, Count Lidochowski, a Jesuit general, was disposed to organize on the common basis of anti-communism a degree of collaboration between the German Secret Service and the Jesuit order. Lidochowski considered the forthcoming bellicose settling of accounts between Russia and Germany as inevitable. And another man named Nach Richtgen did not hesitate to write in 1942. And he says, one of the questions arising from German activity in Russia, which is of supreme importance to the Vatican, is the question of the evangelization of Russia. So what the Catholic Church planned then, Keith, was this. Hitler, you go in with your troops, you conquer Russia, and then we'll bring in our priests behind, and we'll evangelize Russia and make it Catholic, and we'll destroy the Orthodox Church in our path. Now, that was the same thing that they were going to do in Yugoslavia, and we'll read about that momentarily. Going on, it says, this is confirmed by Father Duclos himself in a book covered, in which he said, during the summer of 1941, Hitler appealed to all Christian forces. Now, of course, Christian means Catholic.
Right.
To all Catholic forces, that he authorized Catholic missionaries to go to the new Eastern territories. Now, of course, we know that before Hitler got into to communist Russia, there were other Eastern Bloc countries that Hitler conquered. And when he went in and conquered an Eastern Bloc nation, he then would have those priests go right in and make sure that it became Roman Catholic. Now, let's go on over for just a few moments to Yugoslavia. And Keith, I think there's a tremendous tie-in with what happened in World War I and II and why there is still war going on in that part of the world today. Let me read something to you, Keith. This is called Ravening Wolves. It was written by a lady named Miss Monica Farrell. And this excerpt is taken from the front cover of the book that she wrote, Ravening Wolves. It said, "This is the record of torture and murder committed in Europe in 1941 to 1943 by an army of Catholic actionists known as the Ustashi, led by monks and priests, and even participated in by nuns. The victims suffered and died in the cause of liberty and freedom of conscience. The least we can do is to read the record of their sufferings and keep in mind that it happened not in the Dark Ages, but in our own enlightened generation. Ustashi is another name for Catholic action." Going on over, I could read so much here, Keith, but this is taken from a book called The Holocaust in the Independent State of Croatia. Now, Croatia is predominantly Roman Catholic, and Serbia was predominantly Greek Orthodox. This book was written by Dr. Kostic, published in 1981. This is on page 18. It states this: "The Orthodox circles in Serbia are deeply embittered by Croatian or Catholic conduct. The Ustashi have forced tens of thousands of Serbs in Croatia to accept the Catholic faith. Those Orthodox who resisted either had their throats cut in mass or all their property confiscated, and they were expelled and left totally destitute." Now, Keith, as this woman stated in the front cover of the book that we just previously quoted, we're not talking about the Dark Ages.
No.
We're talking about the enlightened 20th century of well-educated, high-class, wealthy, materialistically speaking, people of the 20th century, in which the Roman Catholic Ustashi brought about the annihilation, not just of the Jews throughout Europe, Northern Europe, but also the Serbians in Yugoslavia.
Is that what we have to look forward to, Bill?
Keith, I believe that Revelation 13 brings that out. And Keith, I also believe that, as Abraham Lincoln said, as long as we have a work to do, we will do it, and God will preserve our lives. But in God's perfect time, if it is His will that we are laid to rest, then so be it.
So be it. Amen.
As long as we die at the post of honor and duty.
Amen.
Let me read another statement, Keith. This is also from the book that we just quoted from by Dr. Kostic, Holocaust in the Independent State of Croatia. He said this: "The mass expulsion or forced conversion of the Orthodox to Roman Catholicism was on the agenda. All measures aiming at the elimination of Serbdom in Croatia was carried out under the slogan enunciated by one of the Croatian Catholic ministers: 'We shall massacre the first third of the Serbians, expel the second third from the country, and force the final third to accept the Catholic faith, whereupon they will be absorbed by the Catholic element.' Thus, the most official German circles personally present in Croatia at the time admit that the massacre of several 100,000 Serbs occurred, and the official Croatian policy was to effectuate the disappearance of Serbs from Croatia. In another word, it was genocide. Genocide. Now, Keith, I could read. I have so many more documents that show pictures of the horrible things that took place in Serbia during World War II, but suffice to say, Keith, that the Catholic Church brought about World War II, sought to destroy the Orthodox Church and communism. Before we close out, Keith, this little section, I would like to read something else from a book called Quest, Searching for Germany's Nazi Past, written by a young man who called Frank Brandenburg, with the help of a man named Ib Melchior. This young gentleman saw a tape of Nazi Germany during World War II. He was alarmed at what he saw because he'd never read about it in history books. And he determined that he was going to go back, Keith, and discover the Nazi past of his homeland. Well, Keith, he interviewed a number of people that were acquainted with Adolf Hitler, acquainted with what went on in Germany during that time. And Keith, Frank Brandenburg came across a piece of information that is astounding. I think it will also shed greater light, Keith, on what you shared from Major Harris's book.
Right.
Of course, you stated a short time ago that they helped John Surratt escape over to Italy, where he was protected by the Vatican for a short period of time. Well, Keith, we know, of course, that there's a lot of documentation today that a lot of Germans, a lot of high-ranking German officials got out of Germany before the Allies came in and destroyed it. And the question that we've got to ask ourselves is how did these notorious, vicious criminals and murderers, Keith, get out of Nazi Germany? Who would think in their right mind to protect a man like Joseph Mengele, who was a part of the concentration camp at Auschwitz, where thousands upon thousands of children and adults were slain? Who would be behind such a thing?
Who, Bill?
Let's take a look. I'll read it to you. I'll read it to you. Let me go over here. This is taken from the book Quest, once again. And I want to read to you, Keith, from page 73. It says, "And you have friends today in South America?" He's asking a man who was an airplane pilot. His name was Rudel. He says, "You have friends in South America?" "Many of them, yes," Rudel said. "Did Martin Bormann survive? I mean, did he escape?" "He did." "Do you know how he got out?" "The Vatican helped him," Rudel answered, settling back in his chair. "The Vatican helped everyone who was anti-communist or Catholic. There was a special escape route called the Vatican Aid Line. They helped persecuted Germans reach South America." Why South America? The countries there were sympathetic and Catholic. The Vatican could exert certain pressure. And that's how the Reichsleiter got out? Rudel nodded. He was taken to Italy. He saw Bishop Hughes there, the Catholic leader of the pro-Nazi Croats in Yugoslavia. Bishop Aulos Hudal, a good friend of our cause, Bishop Hudal? Frank asked. Was he involved in the escape route operations? The author was startled. He was involved up to the cross around his neck. Rudell laughed. He had excellent connections in the International Red Cross. They would provide him with valuable false credentials for the people he wanted to help get away. The papers would be marked subject to political persecution. Persecution, it practically guaranteed their safety. And of course, he had the protection of the Vatican. Hughes was most helpful to us. He saved the skins of a lot of us. Franz Stangl, Eichmann, many, many others. Over on page 75, Keith, he says, many of the top people got out. And then he says that Mengele got out as well. You know Joseph Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor, the one they called the Angel of Death? Of course. I knew him. I saw him in South America. Keith, the Roman Catholic Church did it during the Civil War, where they took convicts, killers, of one of the greatest presidents this nation has ever had, Abraham Lincoln, and they funneled him out of Washington up to Montreal and over to the Vatican. And now, Keith, nearly 80 years later in World War II, the Vatican took men like Joseph Mengele, a murderer, Alois Brenner, another man that Brandenburg found out in here. Alois Brenner was a man who was responsible for the killing of hundreds of thousands of people in the concentration camps in Germany. He escaped to Syria. Frank Brandenburg was told. The Vatican has not changed. The Vatican is still the same. The only difference between the Vatican of the Dark Ages and the Vatican of today, Revelation chapter 17 told us. Let's read it again. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3. So he carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The only difference between the Vatican of the Dark Ages and the Vatican of today is that the Vatican is in secret, in hiding, in seclusion. And the word that John used here in Revelation 17, verse 3 is, she's in the wilderness. But the Vatican has not changed. Keith, we have taken a look in Revelation chapter 17. We have seen how the papacy in 1798, when she received her deadly wound, would have to go behind the scenes because she lost her political power over the governments of Europe at that time. And we found in Revelation 17 that she would go into hiding or into seclusion, just like the true Church of God during the Dark Ages of papal control. And we found, Keith, as you and I have so far in this first tape together gone behind the scenes, we have found how the papacy has indeed done just that. She fomented rebellion in the United States through the early part of the 1800s, through the Jesuit order. She created major division in America over the burning issue of slavery. So much so that a war so terrible, the worst one ever fought on our soil was fought, where thousands upon thousands of American lives were lost during the Civil War. And the blood of all those men cries out at the door of the Vatican. We have then found, Keith, how it was the Vatican who was responsible for the assassination of one of the greatest presidents America has ever had in Abraham Lincoln. And then, Keith, we also saw how the Roman Catholic Church funneled and helped us escape criminals, murderers in John Surratt as he was able to make his way over to the Vatican itself. We then, Keith, have come down in this video and seen how the papacy fomented and brought about World War I in their efforts to destroy not communism, but Tsarist Russia, and then to destroy the Orthodox Church. We saw how she failed in her attempts to do that through Lenin and through her allied powers of Europe. And so then in the early 1920s, she began to plan another crusade, another holy war, Keith.
Holy war.
Not back in the Dark Ages, but in the 20th century in which you and I live today. And so she combined with her buddies in Germany, Adolf Hitler, and in Italy with Benito Mussolini, and in Spain with Francisco Franco. And how through those powers she hoped to destroy Orthodox Christianity in Russia and in Serbia. Her efforts failed once again. The message that the demon spirits at Fatima had given to those 3 Catholic girls in 1917 could not be fulfilled just yet because the Vatican failed again. And so, at the end of World War II, the papacy once again helped murderers, destroyers of innocent people to escape to various parts of this world, to the Middle East and to South America, where those men lived out the rest of their lives with the guilt of thousands on their hands. So we have seen through the 20th century up till 1945 and 1946 how the papacy has worked in the wilderness to destroy human beings in an attempt to climb atop these dead bodies and take over the control of the world once again. Now, Keith, in our next tape together, we're going to be analyzing what the Vatican did after World War II to try to turn the world's eyes away from her and away from the horrors of Nazi Germany and to focus their eyes on another enemy. At least the Vatican wanted the world to think so. And then, of course, we're going to take a look at the Vietnam War and then a greater insight into the cult of Fatima. And then we're also going to come down and take a look at other events going on in the United States of America right now that are heading to a complete fulfillment of Revelation chapter 13. Before we close, Keith, I want to just bring out one other item, and then I think it would be good if we had prayer. Once again, Keith, in Germany and in Serbia, the Roman papacy sought to isolate a political power that would be the focal point of their hatred. They then isolated a religious power. After that, they began to take away the people's freedoms. And finally, persecution of the dissenters was the result. I believe that this pattern of the Roman Catholic Church has been repeated time and time again through the 20th century. And as we then take a look in our next video, we're going to see that that very same pattern is taking place in the United States of America